Welcome to the Fall 2023 Symposium in Human Needs and Global Resources. My name is Dr. Jamie Huff, and I have the great privilege of serving and teaching in the Human Needs and Global Resources program here at Wheaton College. A program that is about to, in a few years, celebrate its 50th year of existence here at Wheaton College. So I think some of y'all might be a part of the celebration, maybe coming up. Is that a mild hand clap? I have the honor of introducing our wonderful guests tonight, but to start, I actually would like to read three passages of Scripture as a kind of prayer to begin. And I'm going to read from three passages, or the same passage from three different translations. One, the New Revised Standard Version. The second, the NIV in Spanish, and the final being the First Nations version of the New Testament. I'm going to read these, not in that order actually. I'll end with Spanish and start with English. This is from Revelation 21, 10, 25 through 26. This is kind of an opening prayer for us tonight. And in the Spirit he carried me away to a great high mountain, and showed me the holy city, Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God. Its gates will never be shut by day, and there will be no night there. People will bring into it the glory and the honor of the nations. The Spirit messenger took me on a spiritual journey to a great and high mountain. There he showed me the sacred village of peace, coming down from the Great Spirit in the spirit world above. Its gates will not be closed during the day. Night will never come, and the beauty and honor of all nations will be brought into it. Así que me llevó en el espíritu a una montaña grande y alta, y me mostró la ciudad santa, Jerusalén, que descendía del cielo desde la presencia de Dios. Las puertas nunca se cerrarán al terminar el día, porque allí no existe la noche. Todas las naciones llevarán su gloria y honor a la ciudad. Tonight we have the wonderful honor of hosting four guests from different parts of our wonderful world. And I would like to introduce you to them before I invite one of them, my friend Drew Indigenous Christian, to come up here and start the evening for us. I'd like to start here with Jochebed Solano Miselis. Jochebed is the director of Memoria Indígena and from the Cuna people of Panama. She's an indigenous theologian and climate change activist who's currently working on a PhD at the North American Institute for Indigenous Theological Studies. She also serves as the coordinator for the Identity, Indigeneity, and Interculturality program of the Latin American Theological Fellowship. She's been here with us this whole week, along with her colleagues, visiting different classes and sharing about her work, both as a climate change activist and theologian, and it's been a gift to our community. Second, at the other end, is Julian Guaman. Julian is a Quechuan from the Quechua people of Ecuador, where he serves as the national coordinator for Memoria Indígena, but also as a secretary of the Mennonite Indigenous Conference. He is here doing archival research. You may have seen him at one point or another wandering around the third floor of the Billy Graham Hall, very excitedly looking for missionary bulletins from the last century or so. He's very excited about that research. And he also has been joining us, visiting classes in theology, a class in geology this morning, sharing about his experience and work as a researcher. Next to Jochebed is Janet Solano Miselis de Brown. Janet is a visual artist, painter, and social worker who's also from the Cuna people of Panama. We learned tonight over dinner and yesterday during a class where she was hosted by Professors Lundeen and Hooker about her own artwork, which in part depicts the faces of women of indigenous and African ancestry, and where we learned how to make molas, where she taught us about her work and her knowledge of a beautiful art produced, handmade textiles produced by Kuna women. And last but not least, just to introduce him and then turn the microphone over to him, Drew Jennings-Grisham is the Assistant Director of Memoria Indígena, and he has been joining us in each and every class, and will be doing so tonight, assisting with interpretation and translation. He is a Wheaton alum, graduated in 2007 with an anthropology degree and also a hunger intern in 2006. He earned his master's degree from the Universidad Mayor de San Simón in Cochabamba, Bolivia, and also did some graduate studies at Fuller Theological Seminary. So if you could just give a little welcome to our guest. Our theme for the symposium this entire year, actually, is Borders, Belonging, and New Creation. And perhaps the opening scripture prompted you to think a little bit about these words. A place that seemingly has edges, a city of peace, perhaps borders, so there might be a place where it begins and ends. But it's interesting that this city of peace is a place where the gate is open, right? And people are coming into it. And what's really especially notable to me in this story, or in this image, is that as peoples come into the city, they're bringing things with them into the city. They're bringing the glory and the honor of their peoples, right? So we wanted to ask our friends tonight to help us think about these ideas, these images of bordering, of edges, of things that mark that something is or is not, or belongs or doesn't. And what do those borders do for us? What do they do against us? How useful are they? Politically, theologically, and otherwise, but especially we're wondering about the nature of belonging. What do our friends have to teach us here at Wheaton College about belonging, and what does it mean to belong? And how does all of this relate to God's beautiful picture of new creation, of a new heaven, new earth, where people bring into the city their glory and their honor of their people? Just their individual gifts, but their people are bringing into the city their glory and their honor. So we've asked them to share with us tonight. I'll be moderating the conversation with just about 4 or 5 questions. We probably could ask about 100 questions and be here for a very long time, but we're going to try to just focus on 5. Our goal is to end our panel conversation tonight by 8 o'clock so that you will have time to ask questions. So as we go, please feel free to make note of what you're curious about or what you would like to know more of from our guests. Just a word for how this will proceed. Perhaps you've never been in a panel session where you are going back and forth between several languages. You'll be doing that tonight. If you speak Spanish, bienvenidos, right? If you don't, bienvenidas, or bienvenidos also, right? But we'll just be going back and forth. That means when we talk a little bit in one language, we're going to talk a bit more in another language. So you'll get to hear a lot of language tonight. But we invite you to, again, think about even our linguistic experience tonight. It's just a little foretaste of the gifts that people will be bringing into the city, right? Their own languages with them. And hopefully we can enjoy that linguistic experience as we go. So I think that's it. You may have noticed outside there's food afterwards. There will be a small dance recital. Just kidding. Maybe, I don't know. But I think that's all we have, and we'll get it underway. Drew, I don't know if you'd like to go ahead and I'll pass the mic to you. Or do you want to stay? You want to stay there or sit? Come up here. You can stay right there.
Okay. Hello. Tonight, I want to give my friends the floor for most of the time. I'll be spending my time up here helping them to communicate with all of you as interpreter. But but they asked me to kind of give us here tonight a little bit of context, kind of set the table for the rest of our conversation. Something I've learned over the years working with my Native and Indigenous brothers and sisters is the way we usually introduce ourselves is by sharing a little bit about our family and our land and who we are, where we're from. So I'll start that way. I'm Drew, or my friends in another part of the world call me Andres. I was born and raised in Chattanooga, Tennessee. I come from a family who's lived in Tennessee for a very long time, descendant of Scottish and English colonizers, migrants who took land that did not belong to them in the southern Appalachian region. In fact, I have a great something grandfather who, as a reward for his service in the Revolutionary War, the new U.S. government gave him 2,000 acres in Granger County. 2,000 acres of land that was not theirs to give. And I didn't know any of this growing up. In fact, one Christmas, my grandfather gave me the certificate that I was very proud of at the time, certifying that I'm a member of one of the first families of Tennessee, from the East Tennessee Historical Society. And it wasn't until years later I realized what that really meant was I was one of the first white families of Tennessee. And I never learned anything about this history of my own family and other people like me in East Tennessee and the Southern Appalachians. Never learned anything growing up about the Cherokee people. Never learned that my hometown was the largest concentration camp for Indian removal in the 1930s. Everything around me, where I grew up, has indigenous names, the name of my state, the name of my city, the name of my street that I grew up on. And never thought to ask what any of those words even meant or where they came from. But so depending on where you're from and your background, perhaps you have a story similar to mine. Perhaps you have a different story. But either way, whether your story is similar to mine or not, I think most of us who've grown up here in the United States can agree that we did not grow up learning very much about the native inhabitants of these lands. And that's on purpose, because if we can deny that they exist, then we don't have to be confronted with the fact that we're living on stolen land. And it's in settlers' best interest not to have indigenous people around, so we just kind of pretend that they're not here. Yet the reality is that native peoples are here, and they continue to live and to resist. And tonight, we find ourselves here in Abya, or some of our friends here in North America would call it Turtle Island. The lands here in this area, the ancient mound-building peoples in the territory of the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi nations. Also the Fox and Menominee and Sauk called this land at different times their home before the arrival of European settler colonizers and the forced transport of enslaved peoples from Africa to these lands. And so I think it's important for us to start this conversation recognizing that the wealth of this nation has its origins in the stolen land of its original inhabitants and the stolen labor of many of its indigenous African and African-descended peoples. And in countries like where my friends here come from, indigenous peoples perhaps are much more visible in a lot of ways, but they still don't enjoy full equality in their societies. And a lot of that inequality is rooted in the theft or domination of their land and their labor, but they also, in other ways, continue to feel the impacts of borders and boundaries imposed by colonial powers and their heirs in order to erase them or contain them in the interest of protecting powerful people's economic and political interests. Today, the boundaries created in our social imagination and dominant societies here, we often perceive of indigenous peoples as people either in the past or people that live way far away from here. Not in my city and not in our capitals. And they might have land, but it's not this land where I am, right? These same borders also, we find, exist in our religious and our theological imaginations, where the indigenous person is always someone who lives way far away in some place that we're supposed to go to them in order to serve them or to evangelize them or to help them, or maybe they're objects of our charity and our missions trips, or maybe we think we have to shoulder the burden of training them with our superior biblical knowledge and help them to understand how they should be as a church or a community of faith. But the question is, are they allowed to cross that border that we've drawn in the other direction and enter into our world and shape us? For those of us like me who are settlers or are non-indigenous, are we ready and open and willing to receive and to learn from indigenous peoples, or are we only have the idea that we're meant to teach them? Do we only seek to change the other, or are we willing to be changed by the other in our interaction with one another? But before we enter into deeper dialogue about those kinds of questions here, about talking about boundaries and new creation with our guests, we just want to acknowledge where we are, and to give a little more context in kind of an imperfect attempt to give you some context, talk a little bit about the scope of indigenous population in the Americas, in Abya Yala. In the land south of the U.S.-Mexico border, there are estimated to be around 50 million indigenous peoples living today, distributed among some 830 different ethnic groups. And it's estimated there could be up to 200 more groups still living in voluntary isolation in different parts of Latin America. There are indigenous peoples in every single country, and the majority of the population in every country has indigenous heritage. And about 80% of indigenous peoples today are found in the countries of Bolivia, Guatemala, Peru, and Mexico. North of the border here in the United States, there are 574 federally recognized tribes, and there are many others that are not recognized. In total, across the continent, from north to south, there are more than 1,000 native languages still spoken in these lands. Some of these languages, like my Kitra brother here, have millions of speakers. Many others have just a handful of speakers left. But for me, the fact that indigenous people and their languages, their cultures, their ways of life are still here, despite everything, is a sign of hope. The presence of so many languages, for example, is a reminder that here in Abya Yala, peoples and communities still exist that are articulating their own stories, their own cultures and perspectives, exercising their own power to direct their own lives in relation to the world around them. Now, many powerful interests want to maintain the lie that indigenous peoples are something of the past, or if they're still around, at least they're probably going to disappear soon. That's what they want us to think. But the fact is, they're still here and they're not going anywhere. It gives me hope because it shows that another world is still possible and even already exists among us. The world in which most of us here in this room today live, and the borders that that world maintains, are neither inevitable nor unstoppable. And each of these unique people groups with their languages and traditions are a world of wisdom and knowledge, of words and concepts and life ways that interpret and build worlds, including within the church and theology. So these are different ways of existing and resisting that demonstrate that in Abya Yala there are other viable ways to imagine, create, and exist with and in this land. So just to wrap up, I want to mention you've heard two terms that I've used, one indigenous and the other one is Abya Yala, which you might hear those frequently this evening. Just to kind of help you understand what we're referring to with those. The word indigenous, and in reality there's a lot of variation regionally and generationally for the kind of preferred term for speaking in general terms of peoples who are descended from people who inhabited these lands before European colonization. You might have heard terms in different parts of the world. They use original peoples, Native Americans, First Nations, Aboriginals, American Indian, or Indigenous, among others. The reality, though, is all of our Indigenous friends would really rather prefer to be called by the name of their people that they called themselves. The fact is that its origin, the term Indigenous is a Eurocentric term that comes from colonial imposition as an image used to designate people that does not take into account and denies their own ways of naming themselves. However, today, many members of Native communities have organized themselves using these terms, such as Indigenous and Native and others, as a way of uniting in the face of colonial states and the ideological and economic forces that dominant settler societies use to sustain themselves. So the use of this name by Indigenous people has given it new meaning, and those new ways of re-signifying what it means to be Indigenous is the way that we want to use that term to kind of refer in a general sense to peoples who resided or descended from those who resided in these lands before colonization and continue to have a special relationship with these lands. And the other term, Abya Yala, is a word that comes from our Kuna friends' language, in fact, but many Indigenous peoples across Latin America have adopted this term as a way to refer to this entire continent. And it's not to negate or reject other names that other peoples have given these lands, but rather it's an exercise that invites us to recognize that this territory has always had other names, it's always had other maps and other ways of being known. So this naming is an act of recognizing the peoples, cultures, languages, and histories that colonial powers want to deny. So with that said, I'd like to thank my friends for their generosity in joining us tonight, and thank the hosts of this land for caring so well for this place that we are gathered tonight.
Thank you, Drew. Well, to start, I suspect that many of us here don't know much about the Kuna or Quechua peoples. So I was going to ask Janet, if you would first, what would you like for us to know? What's important for us to know about the Kuna peoples as we start the discussion tonight? And once you're finished, I'd like to ask my guest, Julian, what would you like for us to know about the Quechua people of Ecuador and other Latin American nation states?
Buenas noches.
Buenas noches.
Un placer poder estar nuevamente en este lugar.
It's a pleasure to be with you once more here
Y compartirles un poco sobre el pueblo Kuna.
and share a little bit about my Kuna people.
Quizás algunos ya lo han escuchado porque estuvieron en algunas reuniones.
Perhaps several of you have been in other meetings and classes with us, and you might have heard some of this,
Pero otros no.
but some of you haven't.
Nosotros somos el pueblo Kuna de Panamá.
We're the Kuna people from Panama.
Mayormente vivimos en la comarca de Cunayala.
Most of us live in the comarca, or the region of Cunayala.
Y según el censo de nuestros dirigentes, somos alrededor de 125,000.
According to our own census that we've done of ourselves, we estimate that our population is around 125,000 people.
La comarca de Cunayala es un archipiélago que está ubicado en el Atlántico, por el Caribe.
The Cunayala region is actually an archipelago along the Caribbean coast of Panama.
Y para nosotros es muy importante nuestra familia, nuestra comunidad, la naturaleza, el cuidado del medio ambiente, la armonía entre la comunidad, la familia, el trabajo y el medio ambiente.
So for us, it's some of the most valuable and important things for us are our family, our community, and that includes our environment, the earth, and our relationship with one another in harmony.
Y claro está la preservación de nuestras tradiciones.
And that means that we also take very seriously the preservation of our traditions.
Es muy importante para nosotros.
That's very important for us.
Algo más que les puedo decir es que somos 365 islas.
And we have 365 islands.
Son islas pequeñas, no muy grandes,
They're very small islands
alrededor de todo el archipiélago.
that stretch all across the archipelago.
Y alrededor de 36 a 46
There's
islas son habitadas por el pueblo Guna.
somewhere between 36 and 46 of those islands are actually permanently inhabited by Kuna people.
Thank you.
Imanacha mashikuna panikuna napani tukuikunata. Y dije, ¿cómo están amigos y amigas, hermanos y hermanas?
He's greeting you in Quechua, saying, "How are you tonight, brothers and sisters?"
Los quichuas estamos a lo largo del norte de Argentina hasta el sur de Colombia.
The Quechua people stretch all the way from northern Argentina into southern Colombia.
En Ecuador somos una nación mayoritaria.
In Ecuador, we're the majority or the largest ethnic group.
Entre los 16 naciones indígenas que hay en el Ecuador.
Among the 16 indigenous nations that exist in Ecuador.
Dos de esas naciones no quieren saber del resto de la sociedad o de los pueblos indígenas.
Two of those nations, those ethnic groups, don't want to know anything about the rest of us. They're still in voluntary isolation.
Pero obviamente los pueblos indígenas que tenemos contactos con el Estado, hemos logrado que el Estado ecuatoriano mediante ley los proteja.
But those of us indigenous peoples who do have contact with the state of Ecuador have made sure that the state is guaranteed to protect those people who have decided to stay isolated.
Los indígenas en Ecuador estamos súper organizados.
Indigenous people in Ecuador are very well organized.
¿Por qué? Porque somos capaces de paralizar todo el país y lo hemos hecho en 6 ocasiones. Hemos realizado levantamientos indígenas desde el año 92 hasta 2022.
So well organized that between 1992 and 2022, we have been able to completely shut down the whole country 6 times.
Y hasta 2 presidentes tuvieron que, digamos, renunciar a su presidencia.
And due to our organization and pressure, we've even succeeded in getting 2 presidents to resign.
Hemos logrado, por tanto, que la Constitución de Ecuador reconozca como Estado plurinacional.
And in that work, we've been able to successfully get the government to recognize the state of Ecuador officially as a plurinational state.
Que el Estado ecuatoriano también ha ratificado convenios internacionales sobre derechos de los pueblos indígenas.
And we've succeeded in getting the Ecuadorian state to sign international treaties on indigenous rights.
Dos lenguas nuestras, el quechua y el shuar, son lenguas oficiales dentro del Estado ecuatoriano.
And I now recognize both Quechua language and the Shuar language as official state languages.
Entonces, hay otros desafíos, pero por el momento creo que estos tres aspectos son los más relevantes.
Now, there's a lot of other things that we could mention, but I just wanted to mention those three things as some relevant aspects to begin with.
Thank you so much. So, part of what we're doing here is to also understand how your communities, your people understand and embody belonging. So I wonder if Janet and Jokabed, could you tell us a little bit about how Kuna people understand, embody belonging, community, being a people, personhood? What do those concepts mean, and how are they embodied in your people, your culture, your history?
Good evening, everyone. I'm very happy to be here with you. I want first to teach you a word in Kuna language. When we say hi in Kuna language, we can say na. Could you repeat after me? Na? Na. Na. We say na, degite, nuegambi. I know this is more hard, but the first lesson is na. Na. And na is come from with the word we call the divinity Nana and Baba. It means mother and father. And na is come from mother, but na is mean to earth. We call earth Napa. And you know, our language, epistemological, come from very close with our relation with the earth. Well, the second part I will going to tell you in Spanish, and Drew is going to teach to help me. Cuando hablamos sobre cómo el pueblo Kuna entiende y encarna la pertenencia a la comunidad en el pueblo,
when we talk about how the Kuna people conceive of belonging as a people,
tenemos que entender la cosmovisión del pueblo Kuna.
We have to talk about the world vision of the Kuna people.
Pero también la cosmovivencia, es decir, cómo el pueblo, es decir, vive en el cosmos.
But not just the world vision, but the way of living and being and experiencing the world.
Para nosotros, pertenecer es pertenecer a la tierra.
For us, belonging, it means belonging to the earth.
Es decir, no pertenecemos solamente en el cosmos de la nada, pertenecemos a la tierra porque somos parte de ella.
In other words, we don't just belong to some empty cosmos, we belong to the earth because we come from the earth.
Por eso muchos nombres indígenas se les traduce como gente de la tierra.
That's why in a lot of indigenous peoples around the world, the name that they give to themselves can loosely be translated people of the earth.
Entonces el Kuna significa gente que vive en la superficie de la tierra, uno de sus significados.
One of the meanings of the word Kuna means people who live on the surface of the earth.
Por otro lado, entendemos que esa pertenencia tiene que ver con las relaciones con toda la creación.
And this idea of belonging then also involves how we relate to all things that live on the earth.
Y toda la relación con la creación implica un sentido de comunidad, es decir, común, algo común. Somos provenientes toda la creación de Dios.
And so the idea of relationship and belonging with all creatures and all of creation, it implies a sense of community, which we also community and common have a similar same root, that we all have a common origin and hold things in common.
Pertenecemos a la comunidad y también pertenecemos porque cultivamos en comunidad.
So we belong to the community, but we also belong because we work the land, we cultivate in community.
Y vemos ejemplos muy prácticos cuando una persona necesita una casa, la comunidad se une para una causa común, que es construir la casa para la familia.
A practical example is when someone's ready to build a house for their family, the entire community comes together and they work together to build the home.
Pero otra forma del sentido de comunidad y de pertenencia es reconocer que los cunas habitamos en las islas y en la tierra, pero nosotros sabemos que ya todo el territorio cuna está habitado por otras comunidades de animales, de plantas, etcétera, de piedras.
And another kind of layer of this sense of community and belonging is not only is it about the Kuna people and where we live on the islands or on the mountains, but also that there are other layers of community that include all living things.
Y finalmente también entendemos que somos ciudadanos de la tierra, es decir, las fronteras geopolíticas construidas por los estados-naciones no son desde la perspectiva indígena vistas como una forma de relaciones que generan comunidad.
And one other thing is we also see ourselves as being sons and daughters of the earth, which implies that we don't see these geopolitical borders that have been imposed on the planet as borders that cultivate community.
Y por eso nos consideramos ciudadanos de la tierra y nosotros sabemos que la tierra es nuestra casa, es decir, es nuestra nega.
When we say we're citizens of the earth, we're recognizing that the entire earth is our home, our nega.
Y eso tiene implicaciones políticas.
And that has political implications.
Bueno, entiendo yo, por el tiempo me voy a quedar hasta allí, pero quiero decirles una cosa más sobre el pueblo Kuna.
And so say one more thing of the Kuna people before we move on.
Cuando hay reuniones, se llama a la gente a que venga a una casa donde el abuelo canta en la hamaca.
When our community has a meeting, we all gather together in the one big common house in the middle of the island where the grandfather or the elder is laying in the hammock singing.
Y cuando una persona que se llama el Sualiber camina por el pueblo y ve que la gente se está durmiendo.
And there's always a person in these meetings, the Swaliber, whose job is to walk through the crowd and kind of see who's dozing off.
Él dice esto: levántense, escuchen bien lo que el abuelo va a decir.
He says, wake up and listen to what the elder is going to say, the grandfather is going to say.
Pero lo dice de esta manera.
And this is what he does. This is what he says.
¡Gabriel Malarque! ¡No hay malo! Y la gente que está durmiendo, pues se asusta y se levanta.
If you're sleeping, you jump up and pay attention.
Y nos ayuda a prestar atención.
It's a way to help us stay focused on the meeting.
Voy a usar eso en mis clases.
Te puedo enseñar.
She's going to teach Dr. Ralph how to sit after this class.
So, let's change a little bit, but also continue on this same thread. I wonder if I could have Jokabed and Julian talk about this next question. So, how have borders, and we'll have Julian talk most first about this because Jokabed shared a little bit, but I wonder if you could tell us, in your experience among the Quechua people, in particular among Quechua Christians, how have borders, political borders, theological borders, whatever borders you think are important, impacted your own understanding and practice of being the people of God or the body of Christ in your community?
En realidad dos preguntas, ¿no?
That's more than one question.
Bueno, las fronteras, un poco sobre las fronteras de la perspectiva política.
When we talk about borders or boundaries from a political perspective,
Cuando se crearon los estados-naciones en nuestros países, sobre todo en la zona andina,
when in our countries, especially in the Andean region, when the nation states were founded or formed,
de hecho establecieron fronteras,
they obviously set boundaries,
barreras, límites,
limits.
e inclusive porque los pueblos indígenas hasta nuestros días, por ejemplo, los pueblos shuar de la Amazonía ecuatoriana están tanto en Perú como en Ecuador, o los pueblos agua están en Ecuador como en Colombia.
And some of those boundaries cut right through indigenous communities. So, for example, in Ecuador, you have the Shuar, who are living both in Ecuador and Peru now, or the Awa, who are living in Ecuador and Colombia.
Estos estados-naciones también plantearon la ciudadanía.
And these nation-states also proposed this idea of citizenship.
Es decir, pertenencia al Estado.
This idea of belonging to the state.
Pero pusieron requisitos. ¿Cuáles eran?
But that meant they put requirements for how to be a citizen.
En el caso de Ecuador, en 1830 establecieron un requisito ser católico.
And in 1830, when the Ecuadorian state began, one of the requirements was you had to be Catholic.
Otro requisito era el hablar el castellano en ese tiempo, ahora español.
Another requirement was you had to speak Spanish.
Tener propiedad privada, es decir, un documento que demuestre que tiene propiedad privada.
Another requirement was you had to have documented evidence that you owned private property.
Es saber leer y escribir.
And you had to know how to read and write.
Todo eso nosotros los pueblos indígenas no teníamos.
And of course, the indigenous peoples didn't have any of those things.
Entonces no éramos ciudadanos sino hasta 1970 aproximadamente en Ecuador.
In Ecuador, we weren't officially recognized as citizens until 1970.
Y por eso los pueblos indígenas de Ecuador luchamos para tener derechos civiles y políticos, pero también los derechos colectivos.
And that's why to this day, indigenous peoples in Ecuador continue to struggle for the recognition of their civil and political rights.
Entonces, con este ejemplo, quiero entrar a la otra parte que ha preguntado, ¿no?
La segunda parte.
Sí, la segunda parte, bueno.
So I gave that example, and now I'll get to the second part of the question.
Bueno, el cristianismo también con sus diferentes tradiciones llegaron, el cristianismo evangélico, quiero decir, llegaron también a los pueblos indígenas.
So evangelical Protestant forms of Christianity eventually made their way into indigenous communities.
21 sociedades misioneras evangelizaron a los indígenas del Ecuador.
21 different missions organizations tried evangelizing our people.
Uno de esos, los más famosos, ¿no? ex graduados de aquí murieron en ese proceso de evangelización de los indígenas.
One of those organizations, as a lot of you know, the famous story of some former graduates of this institution who died in their effort to evangelize our communities.
Macaulay, Saint y Elliot,
Macaulay,
los más
Saint,
amables.
and Elliot.
Entonces fueron asesinados por guaraníes, el pueblo guaraní.
Killed by the Waorani people.
Pero estas 21 organizaciones que evangelizaron, cada uno tiene y tenía su perspectiva de evangelizar.
But each one of these 21 different missions organizations each had their own idea of what it meant to do missions work or evangelism.
Tenían sus celos misioneros.
And they also had their competitions between each other.
Distribuyeron los territorios y los pueblos indígenas para evangelizar.
So what they did was divide the territory up between themselves.
Entonces esto también es una especie de barrera para los pueblos indígenas.
And so that in talking about the church is a kind of border that was put up between indigenous peoples.
Aún así, interesantemente, 60% de la población indígena es evangélica hoy en día.
But despite all of that, today 60% of indigenous peoples in Ecuador identify as evangelical.
Y estos se han organizado en un consejo de iglesias indígenas evangélicas.
And we've even organized a council of Indigenous Christians.
Para tratar de superar entonces estas fronteras también.
And that council we organized in order to try to deconstruct some of these boundaries that the missions organizations have put up between us.
Roberto, no sé si quieres. Oh, sorry. Roberto, I don't know if you have anything you'd like to add sobre la experiencia suya.
Las fronteras como concepto en el pueblo Kuna y en muchos pueblos indígenas es problematizado.
Borders as a concept for the Kuna people and among many indigenous people is an idea that we need to problematize.
Porque desde la perspectiva de los pueblos indígenas, la palabra frontera en el idioma Kuna no existe.
In the Kuna language there isn't a word for border.
Entonces es un concepto no creado desde las perspectivas indígenas y desde el idioma.
It's a concept that was not created by the Kuna people. It doesn't exist in our language.
Porque como dije anteriormente, vemos la tierra como nuestra casa.
It's like I was saying, we see the whole earth as our home.
Y esto nos ayuda entonces a comprender que las fronteras como concepto, pero también como estilo de vida que se ha creado, sí afecta nuestro imaginario de lo que significa ser pueblo de Dios.
And so that goes to show that this concept of borders or boundaries affects the way that we think of ourselves as a people of God.
Y esto es muy importante porque, pues, cuando reconocemos esto, podemos entonces pensar cómo hemos sido en algún sentido colonizados desde una perspectiva de los Estados-naciones que crearon formas de separación y de segregación de unos y otros.
And so we can see how even in our churches the concepts of borders and boundaries that were placed on us by nation states have even affected the way that we think about territory in the church.
Por otro lado, cuando pensamos en fronteras desde la perspectiva teológica,
when we think about boundaries from a theological perspective,
pues reconocemos también que tenemos límites donde decimos no puedo pasar esta frontera teológica porque si lo paso entonces puede decir que entre comillas estoy pecando.
We also have borders or limits where we say I can only go so far or think so far, and if I cross this border or boundary, then we're sinning.
Y esto nos permite entonces preguntarnos cómo estamos leyendo el Evangelio de Jesús y aún también, por ejemplo, cuando Pablo habla en la carta de los Efesios sobre el imaginario de ser iglesia sin fronteras.
And this is a challenge for us then is to think about and consider if we're really living out our faith as Jesus proposed that we should live as a community of faith, or even how Paul in the book of Ephesians challenges us to live as a church without borders.
La imagen del cuerpo de Cristo en el libro de Efesios,
the image of the body of Christ in the book of Ephesians,
es una contrapropuesta hacia el imperio.
Is a counter proposal and against the imperial imagination.
Y ese imperio quería proponer formas también de segregación y de imposición hacia las culturas que eran dominadas.
Because in the empire there had a project of separating and creating boundaries in order to marginalize certain groups.
Entonces para mí una pregunta que puedo devolver.
So for me a question that I could return to you.
¿De qué manera leemos el texto para reconocer que el cuerpo de Cristo? Jesús nos enseña, y Pablo también lo afirma, que ya no hay mujer, ni hombre, ni griego, ni judío, por ejemplo, cuando lo menciona, no me acuerdo si es en Gálatas, creo que sí, y menciona esto, pero también en el libro de Efesios nos recuerda que las separaciones pues no son parte del entendimiento del sueño de Dios o reino de Dios.
So the question for us is how are we actually faithfully living into the way that Jesus taught and Paul affirmed in Galatians and in Ephesians to be a community of faith without boundaries, a body where we don't distinguish between or make hierarchies between men and women and people of different ethnic groups and nationalities.
Y la otra pregunta quizás es cómo el pensamiento y la cosmovisión de los pueblos indígenas nos ayudan a releer el texto, reconociendo que viven de una forma sin fronteras epistemológicas, pero también teológicas y políticas.
And this is a question that I think our indigenous brothers and sisters can help us from their different theological, epistemological perspectives and political perspectives to reimagine what it would look like to live as a community without boundaries.
Gracias. So I think, Drew, you're going to have some conversation about this, if I remember correctly, and maybe Jochebed as well. I know we talked about this earlier, but why is it important that indigenous Christians in Latin America embody their faith from their cosmovidencias, their views of the world, from their lived experience and histories as indigenous people? Why is that significant? Why does that matter?
And the work that we do in Memoria Indígena, that's a question that we get a lot, or at least one that we try to answer in order to show people why we think what we do is important. But there's a couple things that come to mind. The first being more for indigenous people, not necessarily for people like myself. If indigenous peoples are not allowed space to respond to Jesus, to respond to the Spirit on their own terms, living out their faith from their place in relationship with their stories and their identities and their histories and ways of living, then I think the gospel ceases to be good news. So that's a big one. I don't know why we think this is important. At the same time, for people like me and for my indigenous brothers and sisters, I think I would invite you all to imagine what would it be like to actually see a community of faith that is really truly rooted in the land that they're on and the history of that place and the community and the people and the whole community of creation there. What do you think seeing or experiencing a people living out their faith with those kinds of roots would do for the church as a whole, especially those of us who come from more kind of uprooted colonial church background? How do you think that could challenge our faith and lead us to practices that could reconnect us with place and space and land and the people and the other creatures that all share the community with us? I think if we were able to see indigenous communities that really incarnate their faith in these special kinds of ways through their own histories and identities and languages and epistemologies, that it would challenge all of us in the way that we also think about and practice our faith. And one more thing I think is important to mention. Like I said at the beginning, I think every culture and every language on the planet is a unique library of wisdom and knowledge, including knowledge about God, that if these languages and cultures were to disappear, we wouldn't just be impoverishing some like abstract idea of diversity in our community. We would actually be losing part of God's revelation to us as a community of creation. And so I think whether it's a Christian community or not, Indigenous people have special knowledge and wisdom about this planet that we live on, about our relationship to the Creator, that if we don't pay attention to it, then our experience as a church, as a community of faith is that much worse.
Para mí algo que tiene sentido común, primero porque es el sueño de Dios.
For me, the common sense answer is just because this is God's dream, it's God's vision.
Y a veces uno puede diluir el gran deseo de Dios para los pueblos indígenas.
I think sometimes we're guilty of diluting this dream that God has for all peoples.
Pero Dios sueña con que cada pueblo pueda alabarle desde su identidad.
But God's dream is for all people to be able to worship God from who they are and their identity.
Y cuando bloqueamos esto, entonces no es buena nueva.
And when we reject that possibility, it's not good news.
Entonces la pregunta también es, ¿cómo iglesia
So the question is then, as a church,
estamos permitiendo que los pueblos indígenas vivan su fe desde su identidad como Dios sueña?
are we allowing Indigenous people to live out their faith in the way that God wants them to?
Porque si reconocemos que los seres humanos somos imagen y semejanza de Dios, la imagen y semejanza de Dios no fue dada para algunos seres humanos, sino para todos y todas.
If we really believe that humans are made in God's image, we need to actually live like all humans are made in God's image.
Pero a veces en nuestra teología podemos pensar ciertos seres humanos pueden vivir su fe desde su identidad porque son imagen y semejanza de Dios, mientras otros no.
When in the way that we live out our faith, we actually show that we think certain people can live out their faith and express their faith through their culture and others can't. What we're ultimately saying is some of us are made more in the image of God than others.
Y esto nos ayuda a nosotros a repensar entonces cómo estamos entendiendo la presencia de Dios en el otro.
So this should also help make us rethink our understanding or how we see the revelation of God in the other.
La otra respuesta es lo que acabamos de decir sobre el tema de revelación.
And the other answer I have is what we were just talking about, the topic of revelation.
Esta revelación que se da en la creación.
Revelation that we find in creation.
Y por lo tanto en las culturas específicas que viven, reconociendo cómo el espíritu, es decir, la Ruá, ha estado caminando entre los pueblos.
And if the Ruah, the Spirit, is in all of creation, then we must recognize that all peoples and cultures also are filled with the Spirit.
Entonces, la importancia de que los pueblos indígenas en este sentido vivan su fe porque tienen un conocimiento de Dios que los otros no tienen.
And so we can recognize this as how in every culture and every people group they have certain knowledge of God that other peoples don't have.
Sabemos que Dios es misterio y lo dice.
We know ultimately God is mystery.
El Dios oculto, como decía Martín Lutero.
Like Martin Luther called it the hidden God.
Ese Dios oculto lo necesitamos reconocer en las diversidades de las culturas.
And so in a sense we can recognize that this God is actually hidden in the diversity of the many cultures.
Y cuando no permitimos o no deseamos que las comunidades indígenas reconozcan el rostro oculto de Dios en sus perspectivas, entonces podemos negarnos a nosotros mismos cómo Dios se está glorificando en la multigracia en las culturas de los pueblos.
And so when we reject the possibility of God being hidden in each and every culture in different ways, we're also rejecting ourselves and the opportunity for us to discover that revelation of God in those people and in those places.
Y lo último, voy a decir una frase y luego podemos investigarlo en otro momento, pero porque Dios actúa en la reivindicación de los propios pueblos, es decir, cada pueblo es actor principal de la reivindicación de cómo Dios está actuando en su pueblo.
And just to end on this note, we can talk more about it later if you want, but I believe God is actively working among indigenous peoples in the vindication of the indigenous peoples and their being able to be who they are once more.
So to end, thank you. I wonder if, Julian, we could start with you, and like maybe each one of you, Julian, Janet, Rebecca, when you hear this scripture, todas las naciones llevarán su gloria y honor a la ciudad. Can you tell us in your work with Indigenous Christians and Yala, what is the glory and honor that you have witnessed, experienced, or observed? What do you imagine Quichua peoples, Kuna peoples bringing into the city?
Solo déjeme hacer un...
Claro que sí, empecé.
Mira, todos los pueblos, aún los pueblos quichuas que no siguen al Señor,
all peoples, including Quichua people who don't follow God,
cuidan la creación,
they take care of creation.
son pacifistas,
They're pacifists.
viven en comunidad.
They live in community.
¿Qué lo hace diferente con el quichua cristiano o evangélico?
So, what makes a Quichua who's a Christian or an evangelical different?
Además de los anteriores,
As well as those who came before,
entonces tenemos el mensaje de la salvación.
what we have is also this message of salvation.
La salvación no solamente en el sentido de individuo,
But salvation not just in an individual sense,
sino en comunidad.
but a communal salvation.
Entonces los textos bíblicos importantes para el mundo quichua obviamente son Hechos, los Evangelios.
So for us, the most important biblical text for us Quichua people are Acts and the Gospels.
Entonces diríamos que ese es el gran aporte que el cristianismo ha dejado en los pueblos quichuas.
And that's what the gospel has given to the Quechua people.
Y ha fortalecido los otros elementos como el cuidado de la creación, el pacifismo, la comunidad.
And that gift has only helped to strengthen the values that we already had among us, like living in community, caring for creation.
Apocalipsis 21-26 es un texto suelto, no es un texto suelto, hay que leerlo desde prácticamente más antes, todo el capítulo 21.
In reality, this verse we need to read the whole chapter to understand.
Hermano.
Digo, es decir, habla del cielo nuevo y de la tierra nueva. Y la tierra nueva es la segunda tierra. Y dice que Dios lo está estableciendo una ciudad que es Jerusalén y que ha bajado del cielo.
As in this vision, he's talking about how God has built a city that comes from heaven down to earth.
Entonces, y dentro de esa ciudad,
And in that city,
en el verso 24 y en el verso 26,
verses 24 and 26,
se refiere prácticamente que traerán su gloria y honor a ella,
it
dice el
talks
verso
about
24.
the peoples bringing their glory and honor into the city.
Y en el 26 dice,
And in verse 26,
de la misma manera reitera la palabra gloria y honor.
and in the same way it repeats this phrase, glory and honor.
¿Qué podemos decir nosotros desde la lectura quechua?
From a Quechua perspective, what do we have to say about this?
De hecho, eso va a ocurrir en el futuro.
We know that this will eventually happen one day in the future.
Las naciones que han profesado la fe en el Señor serán las que van a llevar esa gloria y ese honor.
The nations who have faith in the Lord will be the ones who bring their glory and honor into the city.
Entonces, los pueblos quichos también, porque seguimos al Señor, llevaremos esa gloria y ese honor.
So the Quechua people, because we follow the Lord, we will also bring our glory and honor.
La gloria puede ser entendida como testimonio, como fidelidad, como esplendor.
That gloria is our testimony, our faithfulness, the splendor of our lives.
Y el honor puede ser como valoración, como integridad.
And the honor is our values, our integrity,
Y sobre todo la dignidad.
and our dignity.
Entonces, los que seguimos al Señor, las naciones que siguen al Señor,
So those of us nations that follow the Lord,
y dice también el texto, los reyes de esas naciones,
it talks about the kings of those nations.
entonces llevaremos la fidelidad y la dignidad ante Dios.
We will take our faithfulness and our dignity into the city.
Annette, what do you see in this passage? As even our artists, maybe. What do you?
Como artista también, como percibes que vamos a llevar a la ciudad.
Antes de responder a esa pregunta, quiero también enfocarme en qué se imaginan que sus pueblos llevarán a la ciudad de Dios. Mi papá me cuenta que él un día fue a la casa de mi abuelita. Mi abuelita no habla el idioma castellano.
My father told me that one day he went to my grandmother's house. My grandmother doesn't speak Spanish.
Ella utiliza totalmente su traje típico Guna.
She only wears a traditional Kuna dress.
Dice que muy temprano él llegó a la casa y vio a mi abuelita arrodillada alabando a Dios.
And he told me that one day he showed up early in the morning at my grandmother's house and he found her on her knees worshiping God.
Para él fue un gran, como él dice, como una gran cachetada.
For him, he said it was like a big,
Bueno, una gran lección.
it was a big lesson in her.
Porque ella utilizó una palabra muy de nosotros.
The literal word she used was slap in the face. It's an expression that we have among the Panamanians.
Entonces es allí donde podemos ver que Dios se manifiesta en todas las culturas.
And so for me that was an example of seeing how God manifests God's self in all cultures.
Que su mensaje es para todos.
That God's message is for everyone.
Que su gracia es para todos.
God's grace is for everyone.
Por eso la palabra de Dios dice en Apocalipsis también que de toda tribu, de toda raza, de toda lengua, de toda nación estará delante de Dios.
That's why also in the book of Revelation we have the beautiful vision of all peoples, all tribes, all tongues, all nations glorifying God.
Por ende, el pueblo Guna también estará delante de su presencia.
So we know that Kuna people will also be in God's presence.
Sean nuestros abuelos que vivían muy tradicionalmente, pero que también conocieron a Dios y que Dios expresó su amor a través de lo que ellos, de sus tradiciones, ellos pudieron comprender quién era Dios.
And I think that also includes our grandfathers and grandmothers who lived a completely traditional way their entire lives, and they had a relationship with God in the only way they knew, through their traditions.
Mi mamá también me cuenta.
My mother also tells me.
Mi abuelo era un traductor de los líderes del pueblo Guna.
that my grandfather worked as a translator for some Kuna leaders.
Cuando estaban en la casa del Congreso, los Aylas empiezan a cantar.
When we're in the Congress House, the place where we all gather for meetings, the Saila, the elder, begins to sing.
Y mi abuelo los traduce para que todo el mundo pueda entender porque es un idioma muy profundo.
And my grandfather, his job was to work as a kind of translator so that the rest of us could understand what the Saila is singing about, because they sing in a very metaphorical, poetic kind of language.
Desde muy temprano mi abuelo salía a trabajar para sembrar frutos.
From very early in the morning, my grandfather would go out to work at the field.
Y él desde muy temprano en la tierra se arrodillaba y le daba gracias a Dios.
And every morning when he got to his field, he would get down on his knees and give thanks to God.
Entonces ahí podemos ver nuevamente una vez más cómo Dios se expresa en
And
todas las
so it's
culturas.
an example, one more example of how we see God relating to and expressing God's self in all cultures.
Entonces, ¿qué me imagino? Que llevaremos nuestra identidad. Porque si no fuera así, el texto bíblico no fuera específico. No dijera, toda nación, pueblo, raza y lengua estará delante de él. Si no se refería simplemente a las personas. Pero es muy específico al señalar que todos, aún con nuestras diferencias culturales, aún con las barreras del idioma y quizás de nuestra cosmovisión, si hemos creído en Él, si hemos vivido según sus mandamientos, estaremos delante de Él.
So what do I think we as Kuna people will bring into the gates of the city? I think we'll bring our identity with us. Because if it wasn't so, then Revelation wouldn't have also said that all peoples, all tribes, all tongues and nations will be present. It would have just said people will be there. And so I think, ¿qué más? Eso fue el resumen.
Y bueno, la otra pregunta, bueno, ya.
Bueno, tengo un minuto para responder. Pero yo quiero que se imaginen
I just want you to imagine
esa figura así de colores.
a kind of figure, a shape full of colors.
Y se imaginen entonces gente que ustedes conocen que son de otros pueblos.
And then imagine other people that you know that come from other nations, other ethnic groups.
Yo me imagino, por ejemplo, gente de muchos pueblos que vienen danzando.
And what I'm imagining is a large group of people from all over that are coming in dancing,
Cantando,
singing,
gente gritando, celebrando.
shouting and celebrating.
Es una imagen de celebración,
It's an image of celebration.
de diferentes colores,
Different colors,
algunos pintados las caras,
some of them with their faces painted,
otros a lo mejor con plumas en la cabeza,
others maybe with feathers in their hair,
lenguas diversas,
many different languages,
unidas a la polifonía de la gran creación.
united in this polyphony of creation.
Sonidos que nunca han escuchado,
Sounds that you've never heard before.
olores que nunca han olido,
Smells you've never smelled before.
gente de toda lengua,
People from every language,
unidos cantando juntos en una danza grande,
united singing and dancing together,
trayendo a Dios
bringing to God
lo mejor de su pueblo,
the very best of their people,
que es su identidad,
their identity,
pero trayéndole al Creador
and bringing to Creator
esta polifonía que se une con la creación entera,
this great polyphonic noise of the entire creation,
y un sonido musical
musical sound
que no hemos escuchado.
that we've never heard before.
Y por eso para mí pensar en la importancia de la preservación de la identidad. Quiero terminar con esto. Juan Stam dice,
And that's why for me thinking about this, the need to preserve all peoples and cultures, as Juan Stam says,
ya se murió, fue un teólogo que trabajó el libro Apocalipsis.
he was a theologian that wrote a lot on the book of Revelation.
Cuando se dice que toda lengua, toda etnia, toda nación estará delante del Cordero,
When he says that when he talks about every people, tongue, tribe, nation will be before the Lamb,
hay una palabra en griego muy importante que es el pueblo, no dice el pueblo, dicen los pueblos de Dios.
he talks, and the Greek word there doesn't say the people of God, it says the peoples of God.
Imagínense ustedes allí también.
So just imagine yourselves being there.
¿Qué llevaremos nosotros?
What will we take?
La mujer cuna, la mola.
The Kuna women, we're going to take the mola.
¿Y ustedes qué van a llevar?
What are you going to take?
What if we could give our guests a round of applause? We do have 15 minutes to ask any questions. If you have to leave now, might be a good time to go, but also I know people might have questions. Remember that our questions have to be translated on some occasions, so we'll probably only get to maybe 3, depending on how long their answers are, of course. And depending on whether you ask 2 and 3 questions like I did every time I asked a question. So I wonder if anybody has a question that they would like to ask our guests. Just raise your hand, and maybe just call it out from there, and we'll have Drew translate it for us. Anybody have a question? Comment? Yes?
So, nowadays we have many immigrants, many refugees, many people that don't belong to the land. So how, if we don't belong to land, do we have that sense of belonging?
Hoy en día muchas poblaciones migrantes, refugiados, etc., que no tienen ese sentido de pertenencia a la tierra donde actualmente viven. Entonces, ¿cómo puede una población que no tiene esa relación directa con el territorio, con ustedes, cómo pueden cultivar ese sentido de pertenencia?
She was in my class last semester. She asked a lot of hard questions.
Bueno, el sentido de pertenencia de los pueblos en general también pasa no solamente por el fenotipo.
The sense of belonging that we have as indigenous peoples isn't just about looking a certain way
O la lengua.
or speaking a certain language
O
or
la
wearing
ropa,
certain clothes.
sino también por la memoria histórica y colectiva.
It also has to do with our collective historical memory.
Ejemplo, aquí en Estados Unidos hay 20 comunidades, 20 iglesias indígenas quichuas.
For example, here in the United States, there are 20 Quechua churches that exist in different parts of the country.
En Nueva York, Chicago
New
y
York, Chicago,
Minneapolis.
Minneapolis.
Pero ellos, la iglesia actúa como comunidad.
And those churches act as a community.
Entonces, porque la idea de comunidad para los quichuas es familias extendidas en un territorio.
Is that the idea of community for Quechua people is about extended family inhabiting a specific place.
Entonces, la iglesia actúa o sustituye a esa comunidad.
And so for those Quechua migrants, the church becomes that substitute family.
Y por tanto, de esa manera, aún en el contexto de la migración, por tanto, el rol de la iglesia, el rol de una congregación es básico en ese contexto.
And so I think in the context of migration, the role of the church is elemental.
No solamente para mantener la lengua,
Not just for helping us maintain our language
en su prédica, en sus himnos,
through the preaching and hymns,
también la reproducción de la cultura material,
also in the reproduction of our material culture,
pero también es la que reproduce y mantiene la memoria histórica y la memoria colectiva.
It's also in that community that we help to continue and to reproduce our historical and collective memory.
Así que por favor ustedes estudien, investiguen a esas iglesias.
So go out and study and research about these churches.
Another question? No? There's a big three people pointing at each other back there like they have a question. Yes. Listen.
¿Español o inglés?
Claro que sí.
Okay.
Español.
Dijiste, o sea, el origen de cuna de la na, ¿de dónde proviene el cu?
El origen de la palabra cuna.
Sí.
Sí, hablaste de na, pero no de cu.
Ay, yo traigo el mate.
Ok, sí, gracias por la pregunta. Cuna o guna, en el idioma cuna no hay fenotipo para, o sea, perdón, no hay fenotipo, no hay una diferencia entre la G y la C o K. Pero la palabra cuna proviene de la palabra gungile, que significa, por ejemplo, gungile es un significado sobre el cuna, que es la palabra kun, ki, le, el cuna que está en la superficie de la tierra. Entonces, gente que vive en la superficie de la tierra. Ahora, ese es uno de los significados, pero hay muchos otros más. Pero creo que allí lo importante de la palabra cuna es el hecho de que pertenecemos a la tierra. Y dule, gente que pertenece a la tierra. Bueno, perdón, pero I'm sorry for both.
To summarize, the question was like a little bit about wanting to explain a little more about the meaning of the word kuna, and Hokubet was explaining that the phrase that the ku part of kuna comes from, like she talked about the na earlier, when there's the origins of those two syllables come from phrases that you can interpret the word to mean, among many other meanings, people that live on the surface of the earth or live in relationship to the earth.
Gracias. Thank you for the question.
How about one more question?
Yes.
Esta fue mi pregunta desde la primera noche. En sus experiencias, ¿ha habido un pueblo que rechazó la fe cristiana y cómo lidió con eso?
Un pueblo que rechazó la fe cristiana, un pueblo indígena, rechazó la fe cristiana. ¿Y cómo quiénes? Nosotros.
Un ejemplo de un pueblo
Bueno, hay muchos pueblos que han rechazado la fe cristiana desde las comunidades indígenas.
So the question was, maybe we could talk about an example of an indigenous group that's rejected Christianity and how Christians in that context have dealt with that rejection. And the beginning of the answer is, well, lots of indigenous groups have rejected Christianity.
Y ha habido diversidades de reacciones desde la iglesia.
And the church has reacted in many different ways to that rejection.
Uno, la iglesia que ha intentado dominar e imponer a la fuerza y la violencia.
And one of those reactions is the church basically just using violence to continue to try to impose the faith.
La otra ha sido de las iglesias que han entendido que no es con la violencia, sino con el testimonio de servicio.
But there are others who have recognized that that's not the way to do it, and rather we should respond by being faithful witnesses through our life, giving testimony.
Otras han reaccionado a partir de escuchar a las comunidades indígenas, han sido menos, pero las que escuchan y consideran que nosotros estamos yendo a las comunidades indígenas y por lo tanto somos huéspedes y ellos anfitriones.
And there are still some others, very few, but some others who have responded by recognizing what we need to do is rather recognize that we're the guests here, they're the hosts, we need to shut up and listen.
Y una más, quizás las que han, después de escuchado, han abierto un puente de diálogo intercultural.
And those who have done that listening eventually take the step of trying to build bridges to create space for intercultural dialogue.
Esos son algunos ejemplos, hay muchos otros.
There's just some examples, there's many others.
Well, I don't know if we can give one more round of applause to our guests. I think they have something for you, if I'm not mistaken. Sí? Okay. Andy?
¿Quieres leerlo? ¿Yo? ¿Eres tú?
How are we doing?
We want to finish by reading a poem that was written by Hokebed and translated by me. I'm basically being assistant director in Memoria Indígena means I'm Hokebed's full-time translator.
Well, sometimes.
Let's see if I can find you here. Sorry. What page is it on? And then later, if you want a copy for yourself, are they?
They are free. They're available for taking.
For the taking. This book is available for the taking. This was a poem originally written in Spanish, but I'm going to read it to you in the English translation. The title is Jesus' Grandmothers. Tamar, Ruth, Rahab, and Bathsheba. Some wanted to erase their faces but couldn't. With the birth of Jesus, the silenced, marginalized, foreign, suspect women are named. With the birth of Jesus, we are reminded of the paradox of life, that what is weak is strong, that value lies in simplicity, that value lies in how God sees us. Tamar, Ruth, Rahab, Bathsheba. They will not be forgotten because Jesus' birth claims us all as his own, women and men, including the foreign woman, the less than, the despised woman, for whom Christmas Eve dinner is not a good time of year. Without home, without lodging, without food, without land, the birth of Jesus reminds us that grandmothers matter. Without them, there is no life. Without them, no hope. Without Jesus' grandmothers, no astonishment. Waiting for the unexpected. Jesus' grandmothers remind us of the point of Jesus. For these women, he is born, bringing hope to the dispossessed.
Thank you.